tonight, it's my great honor to welcome to the store Tim Alberta, who is the chief political correspondent for Politico and whose book, American Carnage, on the front lines of the Republican Civil War and the rise of President Trump, has swiftly become one of the most talked about books of this summer, if not all of 2019 so far. It's not a small number of books that have covered the 2016 election and the first years of the Trump presidency. So by this stage, it speaks volumes when a book about that subject matter stands out from the pack. And Tim Alberta's book clearly has so far. And that's in part because its canvas is far broader than just covering that scope. Within this epic book, and it really is an epic covering years of political terrain over the course of 600 compulsively readable pages, you see the Republican Party bitterly grapple with its eventual nominee for 2016. But you also see the fallout from their decision to stand behind him and the party's internal changes in the years running up to that election that eventually landed Trump on their doorstep. Opening with Mitt Romney overtaking John McCain as prospective GOP candidate in early 2008, and closing in 2019 with Romney once more. What lingers at the end of the book is that recent personal encounter with Romney as he's reeling from the indictment of Trump advisor Roger Stone in the course of the Mueller investigation. It's one of many indelible scenes like that in the book, as Alberta features exclusive interviews with other GOP figureheads examining the situation they're finding themselves in. Paul Ryan, John Boehner, Mitch McConnell, the president himself. Joining Alberta to discuss the book tonight is Jonathan Swan, fellow political reporter, himself covering the nation for Axios. You might have seen him a few times on HBO as well, and known for his breaking news insider reports of the current administration. Please join me in welcoming both speakers to Politics and Prose tonight.
How you doing?
Wow, fired up, huh? Thank you for coming out to see Jonathan. This is really exciting.
So I've actually, unlike you guys, had the pleasure of reading this already. I don't know if any of you have had advanced copies, but I think this will become one of the indispensable books of the Trump administration. But more than the Trump administration, actually tracing the origins of President Trump and how the Republican Party came to be what the Republican Party is today. And one word that comes to mind when I read this book is meticulous. It's meticulously reported. And, you know, when I've published a couple of excerpts from it on the weekend, and I reached out, as you do, to some primary sources who were involved to check that they're accurate. I'm not going to reprint something without checking. And the response I got from one of the sources involved was, geez, too many people talk. So you're not seeing a whole lot of denials because he actually went to the trouble to get first-hand primary sources. And the reason I make such a thing of this is, you know, it shouldn't be a celebration that there is meticulous reporting, but actually we kind of do need to in this era where you have, frankly, frauds like Michael Wolff publishing without making any efforts to fact check, fiction under the banner of nonfiction. So when you see something that actually is the finest of what we do and what we care about, we should hold it up and we should really respect that, because there's just too much stuff out there that is not reliable, that hasn't been fact checked. So congratulations on the book, Tim, and wanted to talk to you about it. I thought I'd start... you know, now you're a celebrated author, Tim, and, you know, you're getting all the accolades. But, you know, I want to remind people that I'm an author as well. And actually, you know, I wanted to read you, because it's germane to this theme. It's very germane to our theme tonight. I wanted to read you a lead from a story I published today, okay? So, and it's very germane to what we're talking about. So this is a direct quote from the lead of Jonathan Swan, Axios.com, okay? President Trump has directed his administration to work to have rapper A$AP Rocky freed from custody in Sweden after Kim Kardashian West contacted White House advisor Jared Kushner about the issue, as first reported by TMZ. Tim Alberta, how did we get here?
Woo. What a blazing introduction. Well, thank you guys all for being here. Seriously, this is great. How did we get here? So I think it's really important to understand that Donald Trump did not materialize out of thin air. We are living in a news environment that is moving so quickly that it is difficult to take a step back and to take a deep breath and contextualize everything that is happening and why it's happening and sort of trace its roots. And there's an argument to be made, obviously, that you could, if in talking about the modern Republican Party, trace the roots back 50 or 60 years. You could certainly trace it to, Pat Buchanan taking on George H.W. Bush, or you could trace it to Newt Gingrich and the revolution in '94. The reason I chose to start the book in 2008 was because I believe you had this really phenomenal convergence of events with the selection of Sarah Palin as John McCain's running mate and the schism that really exposed in the Republican Party, this disconnect between the governing class and the base of the party, and the angst and the resentment that was out there sort of simmering below the surface that not many people saw. And then, of course, you had the financial collapse that fall with the bailout of the banks, and a lot of Americans even angrier, feeling as though Washington and Wall Street were playing by one set of rules and everyday Americans were playing by another, and they felt that the system had been rigged against them. And then, obviously, you also have the election of Barack Obama, the nation's first African-American president. And you have such socioeconomic disruption and dislocation, millions of manufacturing jobs disappearing virtually overnight across middle America. You have a demographic transition sweeping the country, the likes of which we have never seen before. You have an incoming Democratic president and supermajorities in Congress that go about executing a decidedly progressive agenda that certain elements of the country just were not ready for. And when you layer the cultural and the socioeconomic on top of the political, this was building into something of a powder keg. And it became clear, I think, in the early years of the Obama administration, certainly, and then as it moved forward, that this was building towards something. And I don't want to get too far ahead of Jonathan's question here, but I think all of us who were covering politics during this period, and specifically people who were covering Republican politics, the 2010 campaign, Romney's failed campaign in 12, and obviously the 14 campaign as well, we all had the sense that this insurgency was sort of coming for the party, and it was already beginning to batter down the gates. And this wave was building, and we weren't sure who was going to ride it. And obviously, President Trump wound up riding it. And it's really important, I think, for us to reckon with those forces I was describing a minute ago, because the presidency is a transient office. Donald Trump is going to come and go. He won't be president forever. But I think those forces at work will be here long after he's gone. And there's a conversation we all need to be having about how we deal with them.
You spent some time with President Trump in reporting this book. To what extent does he understand or think about, how does he think about these forces? How does he understand his own rise to power in that context?
It's a good question. And I really was poking and prodding him in that regard, trying to get him to address that. And as you know, Jonathan, you've spent time with the president. He is not always a linear conversation. If I'm putting it generously.
So gentle, Tim.
Well, the president I think you were the one who said this when we were having breakfast. The president tends to respond to topics rather than questions. So I was asking him about populism. I was asking him about nationalism. I was asking about nativism. The one thing that really struck me when we were touching on some of these themes was that the president seemed less interested in talking about those forces at work than in talking about the Republican Party itself, I think as sort of as a proxy for those forces, which is to say that Donald Trump gave money to John McCain's campaign in 2008, and then he was bitterly disappointed to watch, as he characterized it, John McCain essentially vouching for Barack Obama's character during the 2008 campaign. He felt as though John McCain needed to get down in the mud. He needed to run a nasty, dirty, no-holds-barred campaign against Obama and his Chicago-style machine politics if he was going to win. And McCain, of course, did not do that. McCain had a very different outlook on how his campaign should be run. And in 2012, it was a similar story. Mitt Romney was brutally brutally defined by the Obama re-election campaign, and obviously successfully so. And Trump, who famously came out and endorsed Romney in one of the most memorably awkward moments any of us had ever seen in politics, Trump was telling the Romney campaign, look, these guys are slaughtering you. You've got to fight back. And Romney never really did fight back. Romney had polling presented to him on a number of occasions showing that there was a real opportunity to be had by sort of going to the dark side of politics and playing the identity card against Obama. Romney refused to do so. I mention those examples because to Trump, as he's beginning to orient his mind toward really pulling the trigger in 2016 and really running after threatening to do so for decades, Trump had begun to be convinced that the Republican Party was weak, that it was spineless, that these standard bearers of the party were not willing to fight. And that's an intangible quality in politics, but it's impossible to quantify for me or for you or for some of our colleagues here who have traveled the country talking with Republican voters. After 8 years of Obama, there are a lot of conservative voters across the country who felt like they had been trampled upon, that they were under siege, that they needed somebody to get in the arena and start throwing haymakers on their behalf. And Trump, I think, was very prescient in identifying that force specifically and tapping into it in a way that nobody else was willing to. He looked at this 2016 primary field and he said, Jeb Bush, the guy can't even stand up straight. He's a wimp. Marco Rubio, he's 5'8" and he's sweating on stage. Who takes him seriously? Ben Carson, he folds his hands like this. You saw the SNL skit, right? I mean, Donald Trump did not take many of these folks seriously. The one person he took seriously, the one person he feared, was Ted Cruz, because he knew that Cruz would color outside the lines. He knew that Cruz was willing to do things and say things that most of these other politicians weren't, except that Cruz was still an elected official. He still had some barrier to entry there, and he still had to worry about his constituents back home. Cruz, if he was bringing a knife to the fight, as I say in the book, Trump could bring a nuclear weapon. There was nothing that Cruz could even do that Trump wasn't willing to go farther with. And I think that identifying that weakness in the party was Trump's greatest asset as he began his hostile takeover of the GOP.
One of the things that's really stuck out to me in this book is, you spend time in the book with Paul Ryan, John Boehner, pretty much every leading Republican figure over the last 10 years, certainly a lot of the establishment figures and then some of the Tea Party aligned figures. Almost all of them, you can tell, even if they don't say so explicitly, recognize that they misunderstood the Tea Party movement. This was not really about fiscal conservatism, was it? This was not the animating feature of a lot of these voters. And I thought one scene that was very telling, and maybe you could tell the audience about it, is you talk to Newt Gingrich, who's probably as keen an observer as anyone about how to sort of, please and satisfy the Republican primary voter. What did he learn in 2012? Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do. Well, Newt Gingrich was at a crossroads in his primary campaign for the presidency in 2012, and he had tried just about everything to get the media's attention and to gain some traction in the polls. And you may recall this, it's a long time ago in these political years, but Newt Gingrich was heading into the South Carolina primary. He had done very poorly in both Iowa and New Hampshire, and his campaign was sort of hanging by a thread. He was polling in the single digits in South Carolina, which of course votes third. And so Newt Gingrich decided that in South Carolina there were 2 debates before the primary was to be held. And Newt Gingrich decided no more going after Barack Obama, no more going after Mitt Romney, no more going into any of these other bag of tricks. Newt Gingrich was going to turn his fire on the media. And it was devastatingly successful. In back-to-back debates, Newt Gingrich had these sort of nuclear confrontations, first with Juan Williams of Fox News and then with John King of CNN, and essentially rallied not just the crowd in those auditoriums behind him, but an entire national television audience. And Newt Gingrich wound up winning the South Carolina debate, going away, winning the South Carolina primary, I should say, going away. And that was really what prolonged that campaign. Had Romney won there, then it probably would have been a very quick and easy campaign. So Gingrich tapped into this other force. And I explain in the book that if you were to look at probably the 3 primary reasons that Trump won, I would say first, and there's no particular order, but I would say first is this incredible distrust of the mainstream media among the conservative base. And I have written about that at length in the past in Politico magazine. It's hard to explain just how reflexively disdainful and distrustful many conservatives are of the mainstream media, and not always without reason, I should add. And for Gingrich to tap into that vein in 2012, he effectively created a blueprint for Donald Trump 4 years later. And like with so many other things, Trump sort of turbocharged it. And to quickly touch on the point about the Tea Party, Jonathan, I do think it's really important to recognize, folks, that when you watch these campaigns unfolding all across the country in 2010, you had dozens and dozens of congressional candidates running under a banner of conservative first, Republican second. Many of them were criticizing George W. Bush in their campaigns even more harshly than they were criticizing Barack Obama, because they believed that the Bush administration had been a betrayal of conservative principles. Medicare Part D, No Child Left Behind, 2 wars put on a credit card, and the skyrocketing debt and deficit because of it. This was a real revolution happening within the Republican Party, and they were basing much of their opposition to Obama, and the sort of galvanizing force behind the Tea Party was these fiscal issues, that the country was going bankrupt, too much spending, too much debt, too much deficit. And we know now that that was largely a farce, because if you look at the voting records of almost all of these Republicans who came to Congress in 2010, as soon as Barack Obama left and Donald Trump came in, they suddenly didn't care much about the debt and the deficit, and that's putting it very, very generously. And so there was a flip there, and I was asking a lot of Republicans in the course of conversations for this book, including some who are still in office, well, what changed? You know, how do we make sense of this? And obviously there was some degree of resistance, if not a significant degree of resistance to Barack Obama because of his skin color. There's no question about that. But there was also this cultural undercurrent in the Republican Party where people felt as though they did not recognize the country they were living in anymore. And that has only accelerated in the years since, and especially during the Obama presidency. And when I talked with some of the leading conservative movement figures, they said the same thing. They said, look, candidly, knowing what we know now, 2010 had nothing to do with debt and deficit and fiscal restraint. It had everything to do with people looking around and realizing this is not my country anymore. And when Donald Trump came down that escalator and said, make America great again, it tapped into that vein in a way that nobody else could have.
I want to get you to read one paragraph because I think it sort of cuts to the heart of all of this. I'd never seen this interview, but you found it, and I think it really nails this. So if you just read that paragraph there with Thomas Massie.
Oh, yeah, this is a good one. As a quick background, Thomas Massie is a congressman from Kentucky, and he is a character. He is a curly-haired former MIT robotics engineer who always has this sort of mischievous grin on his face and very few friends in the building, and he is a very unique character in the modern Congress. As that is Thomas Massie, the Kentuckian, who says he was excluded from the Freedom Caucus for being, quote, too crazy conservative, unquote, said it best in an interview with the Washington Examiner. Quote, all this time, I thought they were voting for libertarian Republicans, says Massie, who backed Ron Paul in 2012 and Rand Paul 4 years later. But after some soul searching, I realized when they voted for Rand and Ron and me in these primaries, they weren't voting for libertarian ideas. They were voting for the craziest son of a bitch in the race, and Donald Trump won best in class. That is a Republican congressman, mind you.
And, you know, you go through the book and you just see scene after scene of these Republicans who, as Steve Bannon once said of Paul Ryan, were seemingly grown in a Petri dish at the Heritage Foundation, who were cultivated, who thought that there was this army of voters out there who wanted nothing more than entitlement reform. And turns out they quite like their Social Security, and they're much more animated by cultural issues like attacking the media, like immigration and all these other things. There is an amazing scene in this book, which I want you to describe, which gets to this. You're having breakfast with John Boehner in the summer, and you ask him whether the Republican Party will outlive Trumpism. And what does he say? He stops himself.
Boehner, without hesitating, looks up and he says, there is no and then he stops himself. I said, well, you were about to say there is no Republican Party. And he said, well, there is on paper, but what the hell does it even mean anymore? Right? Boehner and so many of his ilk, these institutionalists, came up in an era in which politics were largely symmetrical, right? There was a red team and a blue team. And as ugly or as unpalatable as it may have been, parties were strong. Party leaderships were strong. They had the ability to get into a room and smoke a couple of cigarettes and have a bourbon and hammer out a deal. And that, to many of us, is distasteful. That, to many of us, reeks of this sort of insider politics. And look, I am not here to suggest that we need to bring back the smoke-filled back rooms and that that's going to solve all of America's problems. But the institutional weakening of America is a huge reoccurring theme throughout the book and something that we should all be quite concerned about. And I would start, when you think about the institutions being weakened and the lack of confidence in American institutions, whether it's organized religion, public education, the government itself, obviously, as John McCain used to say, approval of Congress is down to blood relatives, right? When you think about the institutions that matter, political parties don't often come up, but they should, because it is vitally important to have strong political parties. Donald Trump would not have been able to take over a strong Republican Party. That is really worth understanding. He hijacked a Republican Party that was ready to be hijacked. And Reince Priebus, there's another scene in the book where Reince Priebus, the RNC chairman, he's doing everything he can think of to appease Donald Trump, because Trump, in the late summer of 2015, as you may recall, is threatening to run as an independent. And if Trump runs as an independent, Reince thinks the Republicans are done, because Trump will peel off all of these conservative votes and Hillary Clinton will coast to the White House. So Priebus is trying to do anything he can to appease Donald Trump and convince Donald Trump that we are not going to stack the deck against you. So Priebus comes up with this idea in concert with some of his advisors, and it's a loyalty pledge. They are going to have all of the presidential candidates sign a pledge swearing their allegiance to the eventual nominee of the Republican Party. I will not run as an independent. And Trump gets on the phone with Priebus and he says, Reince, I'll sign your pledge, but I am too busy to come down to Washington, D.C. I'm going to need you to come up here to New York. Now, this is symbolic, but it's incredibly important, because when Reince Priebus's advisors hear this, they say to him, Reince, don't do it. You are the party chairman. You are the party boss. Tell him to get his ass down to D.C. We will frog march him into the RNC so the cameras see him. He'll sign the document, and then you two go out to the cameras and declare victory, that you tamed Donald Trump. That's not what happened. Priebus said, nah, it doesn't matter. It's a distinction without a difference. We got to get him to sign this. And Priebus goes hat in hand up to New York, to Trump Tower. Trump signs the document, and then Trump shoves Priebus out the back door and goes down and addresses the cameras by himself and declares victory. And I'm not saying that's why Trump won the nomination, but when you think about the 2016 campaign in a nutshell, who were the two candidates that energized their party bases the most? Donald Trump for the Republicans and Bernie Sanders for the Democrats. What do those two have in common? Neither of them ever belonged to those parties. It's something that we all have to reckon with here. The institutional weakening of these two parties, we've only just begun to see it. It is getting worse. And where that takes us as a political system, I think is very scary to think about.
So they misunderstand, and we in the national media misunderstand the Tea Party movement, what it was really about. You have the 2012 election, and the result is misunderstood. The Republican establishment do an autopsy. They have this great plan to win over minority voters and Hispanic voters. And Trump does the exact opposite. He wins with an even greater proportion of white voters. And, we can talk about the demographic destiny of that discussion. But much of this book is this deeply reported, inside the room documentation of the Republican Party doing everything they can to stop this marauder, Donald Trump, who is trashing all over their autopsy, who is doing everything that the consultants told them they couldn't. And this brings me to my favorite quote in the book, and I want you to tell the story behind it. The quote is, "Mother is not going to like this." Please explain, Tim.
Well, judging by the laughter, I'm assuming that some of you read the excerpt in Politico magazine last week. The excerpt in question is from chapter 16 of the book, and what I was able to do was reconstruct the weekend of the Access Hollywood tape being released. And on the morning of Friday, October 7th, Donald Trump and his brain trust were holed up in the 25th floor of Trump Tower inside of a conference room, and they were doing debate preparation because on Sunday night, Trump was set to meet Hillary Clinton in St. Louis for the second presidential debate. So Trump is in the room, Reince Priebus is acting as the moderator, sitting across from him at a table, and Chris Christie is impersonating Hillary Clinton. And there are some other advisors and family members in the room, and they're going through this debate rehearsal session, and one by one they begin trickling out of the room, all of Trump's staffers, and suddenly they look up and realize it's just the three of them. And Priebus knows in his gut that something is wrong. And to make a very long story short, they bring in this transcript that the Washington Post reporter has sent over to the campaign saying, this is the transcript of the audio that we have of the president, of Donald Trump rather, then candidate Trump, making these extremely vulgar remarks about 10 years prior, and we'd like a comment for our story. It's running this afternoon. Well, Trump sees these comments and he says, that doesn't sound like me. I wouldn't say that. And Reince Priebus is beginning to pull his hair out. He is very worried. And the one person in the room who is not beside themselves at this point is Jared Kushner, Jonathan's friend, who said... I'm sorry, I couldn't help. If you haven't seen Jonathan...
I'm making no comment and let the record show my face is not doing any expressions.
Yes, very good. If you haven't seen Jonathan's HBO interview with Jared Kushner, it is a masterclass in journalism. Jared Kushner says to the room, I don't think this is all that bad. And everyone says, excuse me. And Priebus says, Jared, what are you talking about? This is as bad as it gets. And then Trump says again, to no one in particular, I don't think this is me. This doesn't sound like me. And just then, one of his advisors walks in the room. The Post reporter has sent over the audio. They press play. Trump hears his voice, and he says, well, that's me. Now, where this gets very interesting in the ensuing 12 hours of absolute insanity inside Trump Tower, as everyone is running around like chickens with their heads cut off, there are calls coming in from Republicans across the country for Donald Trump to quit the race, including from the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. He's on the phone with his longtime friend Reince Priebus saying, Reince, this is fatal. You have to get him out of the race. And Reince Priebus is fielding calls from governors, from congressmen, from some of the biggest donors in the party, and they're all saying the same thing. This guy's toast. You have to kick him off the ticket. The problem is Reince Priebus is the former general counsel of the RNC, the top lawyer, and he knows the rule book inside and out, and there's no mechanism to kick him off the ticket. The only way they can get rid of Trump is persuading him to step aside. And if you know anything about Donald Trump's relationship with the Republican Party, he's not going to be pushed aside by a bunch of these people who he views as weaklings and clowns. The one person Donald Trump is worried about that day is Mike Pence. Now, the two of them have a relationship that is wildly misunderstood, and I hope that you will pick up the book and read about just their relationship. If nothing else from the book, I hope that you get a glimpse inside their very unique relationship. Essentially, Mike Pence once, like so many other Republicans, viewed Trump as loathsome and repugnant and watched his political ascent in early 2015, middle of 2015, and thought, this guy, he stands for nothing that we embody as conservatives, as Republicans. Mike Pence had always called himself a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order. And Donald Trump would have never identified as any of the three. And yet, when Donald Trump begins pursuing Mike Pence to become his running mate, Pence begins to have a genuine change of heart. And I am not an easily suckered reporter. I can tell you from spending a significant amount of time in this story and with the vice president, with people around him, Mike Pence likes to see the good in people. And Pence, as he gets to know Trump, begins to convince himself that this is not the same person that everyone else sees, that there is this caricature of Donald Trump portrayed by the bloodthirsty liberal media, and I see somebody different. And Trump really appreciates the fact that Mike Pence genuinely seems to like him and sincerely seems to believe that he is not the bad person, the villain that everyone else believes he is. On the day that tape drops, Donald Trump's mind goes to one person first, and it's not Melania, it's Mike Pence. Because he knows that if Mike Pence drops off the ticket, then he's done. Mike Pence is his salvation at this point. You have millions of Christian conservative voters who are not sure that they can pull the lever for Trump, and Mike Pence is giving them the reassurance in many cases that they need. So Donald Trump has gotten very close with Mike Pence and with his wife Karen. Now, Mike Pence and his wife Karen have a very different relationship than do Donald and Melania Trump. Goes without saying. Mike Pence, as you may have heard, does not go out to any functions in Washington where there is alcohol present unless his wife is with him. Mike Pence, when he was in Congress, never allowed female staffers to work past about 6 p.m. in his office because he did not want to take any risk of appearances. Mike Pence and his wife, Karen, are constantly holding hands wherever they go, and Donald Trump always found that amusing. He would look at them and say, oh, look at these kids. They're so in love. They're holding hands, right? Mike Pence also did something peculiar in the mind of Trump. He had a nickname for his wife, Mother. And Donald Trump thought that that was just about the funniest thing he'd ever heard. Pence was always calling his wife, Karen, Mother. So on the afternoon of Friday, October 7th, in the middle of this apocalyptic fallout from the Access Hollywood video, Donald Trump gets a call from Mike Pence, and Pence is beside himself. He is very upset. He's very agitated. And he tells Donald Trump in a very curt, brief phone call, Donald, you need to apologize, and it needs to be sincere. I'm going back to Indiana. I need to spend some time with Karen. We need to pray. We need to think. I'm going to be off the campaign trail for a couple of days here. And that's it. And Donald Trump hangs up with his running mate, and he looks at some of his senior aides, and he says, oh boy, Mother is not going to like this. Sorry, that was a long explanation.
It's worth it. It's worth it. Reading this book, I feel like with Mike Pence, you might dispute this. I felt anyway, your harshest judgment for him. You said that taken as a whole, I think the word you used was obscene. The bootlicking was obscene. Why did you view him so harshly?
So, a couple of things. Obviously, history will judge all of these individuals, and I am just one small voice in a chorus that is to come. I think it's one thing to accommodate someone on policy grounds. I think it is one thing to recognize that your preferred candidate did not emerge as the party's standard bearer and that you have to make lemonade. And we've seen a lot of Republicans do that, obviously. And Mike Pence, on a policy basis, was once a champion of comprehensive immigration reform with a path to citizenship. Mike Pence was once the biggest free trader in all of Congress. Mike Pence used to torment the George W. Bush administration over their profligate spending. Mike Pence was so offended by the Disney film Mulan and its implications about women serving in combat that he wrote an op-ed about it, warning that this is a true story, by the way, warning that the film Mulan would have dangerous repercussions for the nation's youth and their views on women serving in the military. So Mike Pence is a true believer, and he has been for his entire time in politics. And during the campaign, before he became Donald Trump's running mate, he did speak out forcefully on a couple of occasions, namely when Trump put out a statement saying that no more Muslims should be allowed in America at all, period. A full ban on all Muslims entering the United States of America, which of course is not just insane and xenophobic, but blatantly unconstitutional. And Mike Pence called out Donald Trump for that and said it was offensive and said it was unconstitutional. And Mike Pence in private held these pretty strong feelings about Donald Trump. Now, it's understandable that when you join a ticket, there's a certain degree of deference owed to the party's nominee and to your running mate and eventually to the President of the United States, and I think everyone can understand that. But for Republicans on Capitol Hill who know Mike Pence and who worked with him for a long period of time, who know him personally, who know him politically, they have been sort of aghast at watching how Mike Pence, at seemingly every inflection point at which the president has colored so far outside of the lines, pushed the envelope so far, done something so just blatantly unbecoming of the office he holds, that Pence has done nothing to voice his displeasure with it. And beyond that, as you've probably seen the video clips, in a number of these cabinet meetings, Mike Pence has been asked to open the proceedings. If you haven't seen any of these clips, you should watch them. And when I refer to the bootlicking in the book, Mike Pence has, on any number of occasions, begun these cabinet meetings with essentially a 2 to 3 minute worship service at the shrine of Donald Trump. Is that unfair? I'm not going to put you on the spot. And people on Capitol Hill, supporters of the president, conservative members of the Republican conference who have seen these videos have passed them around in emails making jokes about Mike Pence. They started to call him the bobblehead because of his routine of standing behind Trump and just nodding very solemnly. And I think, as George Will wrote in his column about a year ago, and I quote Will in the book, that there is a special status reserved for Pence in the minds of so many people because Mike Pence, more than probably any other Republican in Washington, was the polar opposite of Trump. He was somebody who was just unimpeachably decent, unimpeachably true to his convictions. A man who lived out his faith, who spoke truth to power, who, when somebody would do something that was clearly racist or clearly misogynistic or clearly aimed at stoking fear and playing to the worst angels of our nature and aggravating the darkest impulses in America, Mike Pence was one of the few people in Washington who you could reliably count on to speak out about it. And to see him recede into this role that he has been in now, I think, has upset an awful lot of people, both objective observers like myself, but also longtime friends of Mike Pence, who simply cannot believe that this is sort of who he is now.
I mean, and we will go to Q&A soon. I mean, the other way to look at it is Pence, you could also say, has been totally vindicated. I mean, if you are a social conservative, Donald Trump is giving you everything you want. He has he's in fact got some of the social conservative victories that George W. Bush couldn't deliver.
Absolutely.
He is filling the judiciary top to bottom with ultra impeccably conservative young judges who are going to be there shaping the country for many, many years to come. He's cut taxes in the most classic Republican way, imaginable, with, a dream of, at some point, growth filling up the deficit, and aggressive deregulation. So I understand the rhetoric, I understand trade and immigration, but has he really changed the Republican Party that much? I mean, hasn't he just on a few things tinkered and then basically actually rammed through an agenda that a lot of these guys wanted for a really long time?
So two different questions, and they're both great ones. To the first point you made, that's absolutely right. And I take pains in the book to explain that, and I quote a couple of people who say something that would blow your mind. Some prominent Christian conservative leaders who told me that in their first 4 or 5 months of Trump's administration, they were at the White House for more meetings in those first 4 or 5 months than they were at the White House during all 8 years of George W. Bush's presidency. And Mike Pence is a part of that. And whether it's on religious liberty, or whether it's on abortion, whether it's on any number of causes that are near and dear to social conservatives, Mike Pence has been a vital voice in the room, nudging Trump constantly in that direction. And so without question, Jonathan, one can make the argument, whether you're Mike Pence or anybody else around the president, that I have to remain quiet publicly in order to retain my influence over this man. That if I were to begin publicly feuding with him, I would immediately lose my seat at the table. And that is not an argument that I am entirely unsympathetic to. I really try to take pains in the book to put people in the shoes of Paul Ryan, for instance, who makes a very similar argument. I think the question that all of us have is, at what cost, right? You got deregulation. At what cost? You got these justices at what cost? And look, to the second question you asked, Jonathan, I think a really important distinction has to be made. When you ask, has Donald Trump transformed the party? Has he transformed the country? I think it's really important to recognize that America is unique for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons America is unique is that, unlike so many other nations on earth, the American presidency is both the head of government and the head of state. What do I mean by that? Well, as the head of government, you are charged with overseeing lawmaking, signing things into law. You are charged with working with your co-equal branches of government. You are assigned with nominating judges. You are assigned with the everyday business of running the country. But as the head of state, the American presidency is also indispensably important in setting the tone for the nation, projecting to the world what our values are. I have 3 little boys under the age of 5 years old, and my parents are here tonight. My wife is here tonight. I can remember being a little kid and hearing from my parents not only the difference between right and wrong, which they would hammer into my head and into the heads of my brothers, the difference between right and wrong and having the courage of your convictions and acting upon them, but also that the president of the United States is supposed to be a role model, a moral leader, someone to whom we can all look up to and rally around, even when we may disagree with a lot of things they say and do, that they conduct themselves in a way that is worthy of the country and of the office that they hold. And I think that when you see an incident like last night at this rally, where you have many of the president, not all, but many of the president's supporters, most of them white, in this crowd chanting about a dark-skinned, duly elected federal member of Congress who came here as a refugee from a war-torn country in Africa, this crowd chanting, "Send her back, send her back," and the president steps away from the podium and allows this chant to go on. And from some reporting I've seen just in the last hour or so, it seems as though a couple of people close to the president, including Ivanka and maybe including Vice President Pence, among some others, you probably have better reporting on this, Jonathan, they came to him today and said, "You have to fix this." That was as ugly a scene as we have witnessed in a very long time in America last night. And I think that despite a conservative agenda being executed in a way that would be the envy of lots of Republican voters, it is that failure as a head of state that is the elephant in the room, no pun intended, that lingers over the Trump presidency. On paper, any incumbent president with this economy and with this record of achievement and his delivery for so many of these Republican voters should have a 55 to 60% approval rating and should be coasting to a second term. So why is his approval so low? The country is polarized, yes. The media is hard on him, sure. But there is a recognition that we all have, I think, even some of the staunchest Trump supporters, people who work in the West Wing, who you and I talk with, Jonathan, that something isn't quite right about this. And Donald Trump is going to come and go, but where do we go from here? I think that that is something that we all have to grapple with.
Well, we wanted to open up to audience questions, so go for it.
Okay, two questions, one simple one. Did Trump court Kasich for VP? But the other big question I have is, on Election Day in 2016, did it happen here?
Did it happen here?
You know what I'm talking about?
So the first question, no. It was suggested to Trump on more than one occasion that he pursue John Kasich as his vice president, but to the point I was making earlier about strength, Trump did not view John Kasich, he of the lovey-dovey, huggy town hall, as an ideal running mate. And although he was eventually convinced not to pick Chris Christie, which was sort of Trump's instinct to pick another brawler who would double down on kind of the strongman image, he wound up being convinced to pick Mike Pence because Pence offset Trump in a way that even John Kasich would not have. And to your second question, which is a really easy one. Thank you for asking it. He was asking, was election night 2016 decided here? Look, I don't think we'll...
Did it happen here? But we talked about it ever since World War II. Can it happen here? Did it happen here? What's it? Yeah, I think he's...
What is the it? I'm not sure I follow your question.
Okay. The microphone.
Are we in the Hitler analogy portion?
Yes.
Okay, I'm just...
Happen here in America.
I am not in a position to sit up here and make any sort of comparisons like that. The only thing I'll say is the story of the past 5 or 6 days, in my view, is not what Donald Trump did and said. It is what Republicans, people in his party, did not do and say. And when this vote came to the floor a couple of days ago in the House to sort of essentially reprimand the president for his remarks about these women of color in the Democratic caucus, there were only 4 Republicans who voted yes. And one of them is a guy who I've spent a lot of time with and I've covered quite extensively. His name's Will Hurd. He's from the 23rd District down in Texas. And Will Hurd is in one of the most competitive districts in America, in the 23rd district down in Texas. He represents 820 miles of the Mexico border from San Antonio to El Paso. And Will Hurd is firmly in the crosshairs of the Democratic Party because he is a black Republican representing a majority Hispanic district, and Donald Trump's approval rating there is 20 to 25 points below water. And Will Hurd hung on in 2018 despite the president's unfavorable ratings because his own favorable ratings were about 30 points above water. He is a professional, a very competent lawmaker, somebody who is exceedingly reasonable, pragmatic, will listen to both sides of every debate. This is somebody who I want representing me in Congress. I don't have an ideological bone in my body. I want people who will do the job and do it responsibly and be intellectually honest. And guys like Will Hurd don't come around very often. And the good news is that he's here. The bad news is that by coming out against the president the other day, it's not just the Democratic Party that has him in the crosshairs anymore. It's the White House. And it's going to be very, very difficult for a guy like Will Hurd to hold on to his seat in 2020 because he has publicly crossed the president. So I would just say that the lack of pushback from within the president's party, I think, is a much bigger story at this point than what the president is doing and saying. Yes, sir.
So I'm curious, how did Trump in 2016 and even after the presidency kind of use the judiciary as a unifying issue, if at all, amongst the conservative base? And secondly, were there any certain court rulings from the Obama era that you found really galvanized conservatives or made them feel kind of under siege, as you talked about earlier?
Yeah, sure. So the answer the second question quickly. I mean, obviously you had the Obergefell decision that legalized same-sex marriage nationally. You had Hobby Lobby. You had the Little Sisters of the Poor. You had any number of major court cases during the Obama years that were extremely polarizing, that did make religious conservatives particularly, but conservatives across the board really feel as though the heavy hand of government was sort of pushing down upon them, and on top of the forces of, the cultural left and secularism in America. And so I think that obviously did lend an added sense of urgency to the 2016 election. And let me answer your first question by mentioning somebody else who's vital to this entire narrative arc, and that's Mitch McConnell. Because let me say this, and you're certainly free to disagree, but we would not have President Donald Trump today. He would not have won the election in 2016 had that Supreme Court seat not been dangled out in front of voters in November of 2016. By blocking hearings on Merrick Garland, President Obama's nominee, to fill that Supreme Court seat when Antonin Scalia very unexpectedly died in 2015, by blocking hearings and not allowing Merrick Garland to be confirmed, Mitch McConnell helped Donald Trump to mobilize untold numbers of voters who may not have been willing to turn out and vote for Donald Trump otherwise. And Mitch McConnell's the first person to realize it. He and I had a discussion about this in detail. When you think about the fact that Donald Trump won the presidency by 3 states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, by a combined margin of 77,744 votes. And when you look at the exit polling in those states and the issues that were most important to people, and when you see that somewhere between 18 and 22% of the Republican voters in those states said that their number one issue was judges, do the math. Mitch McConnell, whether you love him or hate him, whether you are a diehard liberal or a bleeding heart conservative, Mitch McConnell absolutely delivered the White House to Donald Trump by holding open that judicial vacancy. And traditionally, I think we all can recognize, those of us who pay a lot of attention to politics, those nerds among us, that conservatives traditionally are much more invested in the judiciary than are Democrats. And that is a big source of concern right now on the left. You have some ascendant groups now trying to match on the left sort of the apparatus that has been built out on the right with the Federalist Society and others. But to answer your question, absolutely, the judiciary was critical to the outcome in 2016. Yes, sir.
I'm curious if during your reporting you spoke to any Democrats who had some regret or even just self-reflection about the attacks they leveled on John McCain and Mitt Romney in 2008 and 2012, in the sense that when they leveled largely the same attacks against Donald Trump, they sort of came off as the boy who cried wolf?
That is an excellent question. And the answer is yes. look, folks, Mitt Romney in 2012, Jake Tapper at CNN said this to me once, and I thought it was perfectly put. At least through the prism of the mainstream media and the media perception of Mitt Romney, in 2012, he was the dog-torturing robber baron. And by 2016, he was the white knight of the Republican Party. And what changed, right? What changed during that period? Look, Mitt Romney, like any candidate for high office, should be held to a high standard. But the obsessive coverage of Mitt Romney's sort of weirdness, his otherness, he irons his jeans. He said that his wife owns a couple of Cadillacs. Look, we all get it. As he said self-deprecatingly when he was wearing a tuxedo at one of these white tie dinners, he said, finally, I get to wear something out in public that we wear around the house, right? And he got it, right? But it was almost to the point of absolute absurdity by the end of the 2012 campaign. As you may recall, there was this presidential debate with Barack Obama in which Mitt Romney was asked about needing to diversify the federal workforce and specifically why there aren't more women in high-ranking government positions. And Romney offered this very, very interesting, well-thought answer about how when he was governor of Massachusetts, he had made that a top priority and that it angered him how whenever he was attempting to fill a top staff position, that all these resumes on his desk were men. And so he went to his chief of staff, who was a woman, and he said, look, I want to get more qualified women into these positions. And as he's answering this question, Romney then says, and she did, and she wound up bringing me these whole binders full of women. Now, to any reasonable person who was listening to that, you'd think, man, that's good for him. It was a really thoughtful, substantive answer. And for the next 96 hours, all you heard was Mitt Romney is a misogynist, and Mitt Romney doesn't know how to talk to women, and Mitt Romney is weird and awkward. And look, folks, I am just sitting here telling you, I traveled to 38 states in 2016 covering the campaign. I've talked to a lot of voters. I will tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt that the desensitization people have begun to feel, especially conservatives who feel like the media is always beating up on their guys, they have been numbed to it. And when 2016 came around, these criticisms of Donald Trump, oh, he's immoral, oh, he's unethical, oh, he's a hypocrite, he's a womanizer, he does and says these disgusting, vulgar things, they fell on deaf ears for a lot of voters. They tuned us out. And that is something I also touch on in the book. I think it's really important to understand the role that the media and public perception plays in all of this. And this book is not meant to hold up a mirror just to Donald Trump and just to the Republican Party. It's meant to hold up a mirror to all of us, because I think every single person sitting in this room can probably do a little bit of soul searching and a little bit of reflecting on how we got to this point, the role that we all may have played in it, either individually or collectively.
Yes. Hi, I have two related questions. One is, to what degree did, in terms of victory and moving forward, will vote suppression and gerrymandering be a factor in keeping the Republican majority moving forward, or not majority, but being able to hold the White House and the Senate? Second is, what accounts for the Republican Party, which has been chronicled in books like Chain Reaction and Nixonland, maximizing racial resentment in dog whistle racism to the now bullhorn racism we have with Trump? What accounts for that transition?
Boy, two good and complicated questions. The simple answer I can give to the first one is that obviously Republicans were able to move right pretty systematically as a party after 2010, not just because of the takeover in Congress, but because of the takeover in state legislatures across the country. And by regaining the ability to draw the maps in many of these states, they were able to structurally get a foothold and solidify their power. Now, the 2020 census is coming, and there will be an opportunity for Republicans and Democrats alike to fight for the ability to draw those maps. And that is a huge focus right now, obviously, for Democrats who feel as though they have been targeted systematically and very effectively by these Republican gerrymanders. I should remind everyone that political parties exist to promote and protect their own power, and the Democrats have been known to do a little bit of gerrymandering themselves. And as high-minded as I would like to be about this process and these calls for reform, I will believe that Democrats, after winning back some of these state houses, will not abuse the gerrymandering power when I see it. Because if you look at some states like Maryland, it's a bit of a Picasso painting.
if I were king for a day, I'd wave a magic wand and we would have a nonpartisan redistricting commission in every state in America. We would redraw as many of these lines as close to 50 as possible, not because it would give us a bunch of mushy moderates, but because we could actually have a debate of ideas. Let me say this really quickly because it shocks people when I say it. I give talks all the time about Congress, and when I say this, it blows people away. Democrats flipped 40 seats last November, right? That's a wave election by anybody's metric. 40 seats is a big deal. It is a sweeping rebuke to the president's party. And yet, how many voting members are there in the House of Representatives? Anybody? 435. 435. What is 40 out of 435? About 8.5%. Okay? You go back to 2010, biggest wave election we've seen in our lifetimes. Anybody remember how many Republican pickups there were in 2010? 63, my man. 63 Republican pickups in 2010. Biggest wave election we've ever seen in our lifetimes. What's 63 out of 435? It's about 14%. I cheated. I'm not that good at math, I promise. I've memorized these things. The point I'm trying to make to you is that in the biggest wave election we'd ever seen in our lifetimes in 2010, 86% of the seats in the U.S. House of Representatives remained loyally partisan, locked down by one of these two parties. And in 2018, with another big wave election, 92% of them roughly remained locked down by one or the other party. What does that tell you? It tells you that the overwhelming majority of the elected officials we send to Washington are not chosen in November. They are chosen in their primaries. And what do we know about primary turnout? Well, in your average off-year congressional primary election, turnout is going to be somewhere between 7 and 14%. And who are the 7 to 14% who are turning out to vote in those primaries? Are they the very reasonable, persuadable moderates in the middle of the electorate who just want, competent governance and who are willing to listen to arguments on both sides? Generally not. And to your uncle who sends the weird emails and your colleague who posts the crazy stuff on Facebook, right? And God bless them because at least they're engaged with the process. But why aren't the rest of us? We keep sending these people back to Congress and expecting a different result. Congress has a huge personnel problem, and a big reason why is because so many of the people we send there, the overwhelming majority of the people we send there, are elected in primaries. And when you never face a general election threat in your district, what is the only incentive you have? It is to protect yourself in a primary. And when you are oriented as a lawmaker toward protecting your flank in a primary every day you wake up, it's going to have some really bad results for the country. And as worried as we are, you got me on a tangent here, but as worried as we all may be about the executive branch and some of its unsteadiness right now, the legislative branch, in my opinion, is a much bigger concern because the presidency is a transient office. Trump will come and go, but the legislative branch of the federal government is structurally in deep, deep trouble, and there's no end in sight for it. To the second question really quickly about the racial dog whistling, look, I just mentioned what happened last night. As you said, it's not a dog whistle at this point. It's just not. And Donald Trump is obsessed with the base. Jonathan, you know this better than anybody. If you talk to people around the president, he talks incessantly about the base. And when he talks about the base, he is talking generally very narrowly about the core people who come to his rallies, who wear the MAGA hats. These typically tend to be your blue collar, your more rural and exurban, middle and working class Americans, white, evangelical in many cases, and they are the true believers, right? They are the people who are with Trump no matter what. As he said, if he shot somebody on Fifth Avenue, they'd still be behind him. But what Trump is missing is that with incidents last night, with every one base voter who he may be mobilizing, he's probably also alienating a suburban, college-educated, socially moderate Republican who wants tax cuts, and they may even want conservative judges, but they're scared out of their mind by what they saw last night. There's an old saying in Republican campaigns, why would a Republican ever go address the NAACP? A Republican presidential candidate, why would you ever go address the NAACP? Because you're not going to pick up any more black votes. And the answer is always, it's not to pick up black votes. It's to pick up the votes of white suburbanites who want to see you engage with the NAACP. Politics is a coalition business. And Donald Trump won the presidency in 2016, not just because of his base that we all love to read about and all of these stories from middle America about the, auto mechanic in the diner in Ohio somewhere. Those people matter, obviously, and they are, big supporters of the president. But the president won his campaign because he had overwhelming support of these traditionally Republican suburban moderates. And what do we know? We know that in 2016 they voted for him, and we also know that in 2018, by virtue of this Democratic takeover, at least a significant chunk of those traditionally Republican suburban moderates, they flipped. They voted for Democrats in the suburbs from Salt Lake City to Orange County to Detroit to Atlanta, all across the country. So Donald Trump is playing with fire here. And it's not just because he's mobilizing the Democratic base. It's because he is potentially alienating that other half of his coalition that he needs to win in 2020.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
We are running out of time, but I want to take these last 3 questions here, last 2 questions here, if that's okay.
Sorry, I'm giving very long answers.
Hi. This may be beside the point at this point, but during the campaign, I always thought that Donald Trump's hoped for outcome would be to win the popular vote and lose the electoral vote, and he could go back to his business and say he was cheated and, not be worried with the running of the government, because he didn't obviously prepare anything for a transition, and election night he looked pretty shocked and like he didn't want this.
Well, I would draw a distinction, and I want you to weigh in on this also. I would draw a distinction between not wanting to win and not expecting to win, because I did an awful lot of reporting on this, and I was never able to find anybody who could credibly tell me that he did not want to win. Donald Trump is a very competitive guy. And we had to listen for 18 months to all of these talking heads on cable tell us that this was just to promote his hotel, that this was just to get his name back in the news, that he just loves the reality TV glare, that Donald Trump was going to drop out before the Iowa caucuses. He didn't actually want to be president. What all of that missed is that Trump is a fiercely competitive individual and that he loves the grind of competition. I don't think that Donald Trump expected to win. And matter of fact, all of my reporting tells me that he did not expect to win. As I say in describing election night in the book, Trump had to pretty quickly rewrite his election night speech because he did not have a victory speech prepared. And when Reince Priebus whispered in his ear in one of their little war rooms, "I think you're going to win," everybody in the room sort of stopped and time stood still. And Trump said, "Okay, we got to go upstairs. We got to go to the residence. I don't have a speech." So Donald Trump, from everything I know, was certainly not expecting to win the presidency because he could see the same polling that we all saw, and not just the public polling. Anybody inside of his campaign who tells you that they thought that Donald Trump was going to win is lying to you. I'm telling you that straight up, and that includes Steve Bannon, who loves to go around telling everybody that Trump was going to win. He knew it from day one. It's nonsense, okay? The one Republican I did not interview for this book was Steve Bannon, and Swan gave me a high five for that the other day because... for crying out loud, talk about an unreliable source. So that is the distinction I would draw, but you tell me what you think about that.
No, I mean, I covered the campaign. Is this even working?
Shout it out.
I covered the campaign. He 100% wanted to win. I don't know what's going on there. He 100% wanted to win. And, I remember being in a barn in Virginia Falls Church, Virginia at like 1 a.m. on Monday morning, I guess, last few days of the campaign. And Donald Trump was doing his 8th rally of the day or something. And he wanted to win. He really wanted to win. As much as anything, he hates to be humiliated. People close to him believe that he entered the campaign really as a promotional vehicle. One person close to him told me he described it as the world's greatest infomercial. But I think one of his more revealing interviews early on, he says, I think it's with maybe Mark Halperin, he says he thinks, maybe it's not on the record, maybe they've said that subsequently in public, that he thought he gave himself a 20% chance of winning. As time went on, a couple of things happened. He got addicted to the crowds, and I don't know if people in this audience have been to Trump rallies, but I've been to a lot of them, and the only thing I can explain, I've covered politics in 2 countries. I've never seen a politician have such a visceral connection with a crowd. And the only thing I can compare it to is like being at a Rolling Stones concert. They know the lyrics. It's call and response. He'll say Hillary and the crowd will just immediately start chanting, lock her up. He'll say the media, the crowd will immediately start chanting CNN sucks. It's a drug for him, and he was intoxicated and he loved it. And then as time went on, he thought, well, maybe I can win, I guess. I'm down to the last 2. Tim's right. None of them thought they can win. Steve Bannon does like to remind me, he did send an email, which I still have 2 weeks before the election, where he did predict all the states. I tend to think it was bluster more than anything, but he really was saying behind the scenes that he was going to win, if that makes it any different. But other staff were like pre-briefing us as reporters and saying, here are all the reasons why he lost. This is before the election. And here's the way you can spin it, etc. So, you know, that's the reality.
You know,
yeah.
To add a final really quick thought to that, I spent the final week of October, I spent that week on the campaign plane with Vice President Pence, then Governor Pence. And I can tell you, as surely as I know that I am sitting here with you, that nobody on that plane, save for maybe Mike Pence, believed that they were going to win. And it was really interesting because they were all beginning to spin me essentially on Mike Pence 2020, right? They were all attempting to sort of, you know, polish Pence as the guy who was the stable figure in the campaign and who rejected the ugliness and the guy who was going to come out of this looking good. And something really interesting happened. And it happened the day after, as you may recall, Pence's plane went off the runway at LaGuardia, and I was on that plane, and it was kind of a remarkable scene as the Secret Service jumped up with their pistols and hovered near Pence, and nobody quite knew what the hell to make of any of it. Everyone on that plane that I was with for almost a week, all of Pence's top staffers said the same thing. No way. We've seen all the numbers. He cannot win. Trump cannot win. On the last day I was with them, we had to get on a different plane that didn't have Wi-Fi because of the earlier night's incident. And just as our plane was coming down into Pennsylvania, dipping into cell phone range, every single person's plane on the phone blew up with an alert that James Comey had sent a letter to Congress reopening the investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails. And I will tell you, it's indelible in my mind. I can see it today. There weren't many of us on the plane. There were 5 reporters, I believe, and 4 or 5 Secret Service, and the vice president, and 5 or 6 of his staff. And we're all sitting there clustered. And I'm telling you, kid on Christmas morning does not begin to describe the looks on the faces of the Pence people, because for the first time in the entire campaign, there was a flicker of hope. However fleeting, but a flicker of hope that, oh my goodness, can you believe our luck? We might actually win. And I will remember that until the day I die. Yes, sir.
It's my recollection on the day the Access Hollywood tapes were released, the emails for John Podesta were released like half a day later, I think. So that was another factor in place. But my question is, why is my conservative brother forgotten that he's an anti-communist or suspicious of Russia?
You know, the Russia thing is actually really fascinating because you will hear a lot of Republican defenders of the president say, you know, focus on what this administration does, not on what he says. And I think that by and large, that's nonsense. I think that, as I explained a minute ago, what the president says is of enormous importance. It moves markets. It moves military personnel. The president is the most powerful person in the world. Russia is actually a pretty interesting example of what they are talking about, however, because if you were to examine on a policy basis the administration's approach to Russia, not his personally, but the administration's and most Republicans in Congress, you would think that it is a pretty typical Republican, you know, cookie cutter Republican approach to Russian relations in terms of sanctions, in terms of some help for allies in the region. The president's relationship with Vladimir Putin is so bizarre that I'm not sure we will ever get to the bottom of it. And I'm not trying to be funny in saying that. It's just the truth. I don't know that we will ever understand. Look, and it's not just Putin, right? Donald Trump has this affinity for strongmen across the globe. We have seen it time and again, and it is vexing, not just to us, but to people in the administration. I don't think that it will ever be thoroughly explained, but with Russia in particular, there is a huge chasm between the president sort of playing footsies with Vladimir Putin and joking with him about election interference and how he locks up journalists. Isn't that hilarious? All that stuff contrasted against the administration itself and the State Department and the Republican Congress and how they have approached Russia. It has been much more traditional. So it's a little bit odd in that respect.
Thank you for coming out tonight, everybody. And thank you so much for...
Thank you, guys.